Hi everyone, welcome to the panel, Learning to Love Your Legacy. As you begin working in tech companies, there is a widespread myth that working in legacy systems is not what we should be aiming for. But the topic of legacy software is not one which most people look forward to, but one that I've found to be widely misunderstood. After all companies that have been running for some time have found successful ways to deal with their own legacy systems. In today's panel, we've brought together a group of people who will discuss some of the following. What is considered legacy software? Has their point of view to legacy changed over time? And what triggered that change? And what are some of their top tips for effectively managing their change to legacy? Join us in the DetroitLabs Slack channel, where we'll take some questions towards the end. But first, let's meet our panelists. First up, we have Nelida Velazquez, lead developer at DetroitLabs. She's been a professional developer for 11 years, working with major brands both in the United States and in her home country of Mexico. She's done mostly iOS development, but for the past 2 years, she's decided to take on web and backend projects, where there's often a lot of legacy. In 2018, she gave a talk called Embrace Your Legacy Code, where she touched upon some of the points we'll discuss today. Next up, we have Jack Franklin, software engineer at Google. Jack works on the Chrome dev tools team at Google and has previously worked in London at many different startups, helping to maintain and migrate large legacy code bases to a more modern tech stack. He's spoken at multiple conferences on migrating legacy software and maintaining large code bases over time. And our third panelist is Suman Roy, Director of Engineering at the New York Times. Suman is in the publishing team, which is responsible for building tools for the world's best newsroom to do their jobs more effectively. He's worked on, built from scratch, and migrated significant legacy projects at the Times. These days, Suman spends a lot of time thinking about how to make the most out of legacy systems, his team's own, when to evolve them, and when to replace them. Welcome all to the panel.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hey.
All right, let's start with this question. Legacy software is confusing. We all have different terms. So how do you go about defining legacy software? Let's start with Nelida.
Okay, I will use this term that I use when I give my talk. I used to think that legacy code was something bad and code that it was very old. And one coworker once told me legacy code is code that you wrote yesterday. And at the time I didn't understand this, but with time I have realized that it makes a lot of sense, and it also makes you to take a lot of responsibility because sometimes we see legacy code as something completely external, something that somebody did to us, but it's not something that we do or that we write. And I really like this definition, because you go your day like knowing that you are writing legacy code, and I like to be conscious about it and know what legacy are you leaving to other people.
That's a really great definition. Thank you, Nelida. What about Suman? What's your definition for legacy code?
I think Nelida's definition is really great. Another definition is anything that doesn't have tests is automatically considered legacy. I think in my experience in practice, a piece of software becomes legacy as soon as there's a shift in the way, in the standard way of doing that, if you were to do it today. And, that at the speed of change right now, that happens really quickly. Within 1 to 2 years, the way you do something changes. And that in practice, sort of that is my definition of it. And even that's an evolving definition.
A very great definition as well. What about you, Jack?
Yeah, I would agree with both the definitions we've had so far. I think my mindset has shifted over the past few years. I used to think of legacy code as just like old code that I didn't write. which really is, I think, of a bit of a harsh way to judge it. So I've tended to lean more towards what Suman was saying as well about it's really code that is written very differently to how I would write it now, whether that's new libraries or techniques have come out, or whether that's you're using an old version of a programming language or even a programming language that isn't really used anymore. That tends to be what I sort of separate between old code and legacy code.
Great. Yeah, that definitely resonates with me as well. Let's talk about some of the oldest code bases that you've worked with. So think about the oldest code base that you've worked with. How old would that be and what circumstance was that in? Maybe let's start with Jack.
So I think the oldest one for me would be the Chrome DevTools code base, which I work on at the moment. So I'm not sure when the first version of the Chrome DevTools came out, but I think we're talking over 10 years ago now. I think it must be at least. So yeah, it's a big code base as well. There's a lot of features in it. And it's also interesting because over time, the DevTools code base has just grown so much because DevTools, when it first came out, did a lot less than it does now. And we had fewer features on the platform. So for me, this is a really interesting code base to get to work in just because of the time it spans and also all the features that have been added and removed over time. But I think given everything and all the things that have changed, it's not in bad a state. Although I'm a bit biased, I have to say that, right?
I can imagine. Also with the evolving web standards and making sure the tools are keeping up to pace. 10 years, impressive. Nelida, what about you?
Not that old, really. I was thinking about this question, and I think probably the oldest one is, at the time, it was 6 years. The thing that made me realize about this legacy code concept and everything, it was in iOS, we have Swift, this new language, and a lot of people started considering code bases written in Objective-C as legacy code. And that's where all this comes from. But it's really, I think, not very old code, but like Suman mentioned, like everything changes so fast now that you start seeing these code bases already as legacy.
Yeah, and something as fundamental as the programming language shift is definitely seen often as a legacy one, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in a bit. What about you, Suman? What's the oldest code base? I remember you were saying you were at the Times for 8 years already.
Yes, and the Times has had a presence on the web since the mid-90s, so the oldest code is probably from that I'm familiar with. So a lot of people will be familiar with your old CGI bins and Perl scripts that were pretty state-of-the-art at the time and were thoughtfully written, but are obviously not how you build things anymore. So that's probably the oldest. I should add that I use legacy software all the time. I mean, a lot of stuff that I do on the command line were written decades ago and are still, they have been maybe touched on, but they're fairly old.
That's very true. I think we were always working on the shoulders of giants and very old software. All right. Let's talk about legacy love or hate stories. Nelida, can you think of maybe your most hated or your most passionate story about working with legacy? Was there a defining moment for you?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I don't think there's a hate story. Necessarily, for me, it was more like a realization. Like I mentioned, when I was working on Objective-C code bases and seeing a lot of frustration from people, you want to do all the new stuff and learn the new language, and I think sometimes it can feel a little bit frustrating to have to maintain a code base that you might think is probably not the new stuff, and I think it was more that realization than a hate story. I don't think I ever saw it as something bad necessarily. In any case, I saw people seeing code that it was and thinking that it was bad because it was old. And for me, it was, wait, that person can be me. You know, I could be that person that wrote that code. And I like to think that the people write the code with the tools and the knowledge that they have at the time, and they generally do the best they can when writing code. And you know, it's the tools that you have, and it was more that realization of that I'm working with legacy code. It's not something that I thought initially when in my first years of working with iOS. You know, to me it was something new, and when this language comes out, it's like, whoa, what's going to happen now with this code base?
Yeah, I think seeing that evolution is a really exciting time, and also a great attitude around thinking about, you know, people are trying to do the best they can given their tool sets. Let's talk about Google. So Jack, you're at Google. Google's now about 22 years old, and I can imagine there's some sort of interesting code bases there. So what are they really like?
It's a good question. You know, I can't speak for every code base across all the company, but one of the things I've really noticed since joining is there's very much a lot of information to build on. And you mentioned earlier, Pat, standing on the shoulders of giants. That kind of happens internally as well. Just for example, if you want to work on a front-end based project, there's a lot of infrastructure already built for you. All the tooling is consistent across most of the projects. There's a massive internal style guide for how we structure things, how we write things, how we add tests. So my experience, it's actually been great, and it feels very productive because you've got a problem to solve, and the sort of infrastructure build side of that is often just solved completely for you. So you kind of get quite a running start on everything. I guess in any code base, there are probably some bits that are less good than other bits, just because over the course of time, things change. But on the whole, I think a lot of the problems have got answers, and you can go and find those answers and feel pretty productive pretty quickly across all the code. And a lot of it is open as well. So I can go and look at various different code bases and figure out, say, who wrote this and where are they based, and can I message them and get help as well. So it's nice being able to sort of browse any of the code bases I want, most of them, and sort of find who wrote that, and then I can ping them if I need to. And so it all feels very connected, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's a really great story. I think just hearing about how legacy could be helping to create a productive atmosphere and sort of get rid of problems that you just don't need to worry about, I think that's really fantastic. So you can focus on interesting, newer problems. So thank you for that. Yeah. Suman, how do you face it if one of your teams is handed over a legacy product, and how would you engage everyone on that?
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely happens, and that can happen for a number of reasons. Maybe there was a reorg in the company, and teams were restructured, and so you wound up with some orphaned software or orphaned code bases. Or maybe there's a new opportunity, and we're sort of galvanizing around that, and that sort of new team owning other bits of software would make things go faster. So there could be a variety of ways. I think as a leader within the organization, I try to be very clear about why, that it makes the most sense within the organization for a team to own the software. It shouldn't just be a decision made in a vacuum, and then try to involve the team that might be owning the software as early as possible. So they might have input that sort of influences that decision to a certain extent. But let's assume all of that went as smoothly as it can, and my team, one of my teams got a new piece of, or a legacy software to own. I think the key thing is you ask some questions. You try to find out as much about the software as possible. So what is the test coverage like? What is the documentation like? What are the sort of gremlins in the system? How often do you have incidents? What are some of the gotchas? Like how to sort of try to establish as best a representation of the state of the system right now is pretty fundamental. That basically you're trying to make it as painless as possible for your team to own the software. So that's sort of pretty critical, and you do that as an activity with the team. They sort of find out other. So, and then you try to say, well, if you're keeping the software around, it is still adding value to the company, and being able to add value or more value in this case is an opportunity, and we've been entrusted with sort of doing that, and that's with more responsibility, that's fundamentally a good thing. There's an opportunity to maybe make things simpler, depending on whether or not we continue to add to that software or not. So it's a lot of things. Having said all that, sometimes decisions are made in a vacuum, and you wind up with something that really has no connection to the rest of your systems, and then you sort of maybe go into a defensive phase, and you still try to establish the state, and you try to understand, you try to make sure that you can support it, and try to minimize the pain sort of ownership of anything new, because anything new, you have to maintain it. There is no choice. There will be security updates. You have to upgrade things. If you let things just sort of sit idle, your situation is going to get worse. Software left idle does rust, in my experience. It doesn't just stay as good as it was when you got it.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you there, and particularly the challenges of keeping libraries up to date. With the amount of dependencies teams have today, it's a nightmare, but important to do. We've heard lots of different examples of different types of legacy. What are your two strategies of dealing with this? So if you were to give people 2 tips about how you would cope with legacy, let's start with Nelida. What are your 2 tips for helping people overcome legacy?
Yeah, some things that have worked for me in the past, Suman already touched a little bit on this, is finding out if there is some documentation. And even sometimes the documentation goes outdated too. But even if it's outdated, I have found that documentation is helpful. So that is one thing. Getting to know the app as a user, just using the app, or if it's an API, using the API, looking at all these endpoints and seeing the results that it returns, and maybe finding inconsistencies, getting to know the app or the API as a user, pairing with the other developers. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you will find someone that is already maybe familiar with the code base. But if not, we find out different things in different ways. So maybe I understood some part of the code, and my team members, my coworkers, found out how other part of the code works. So we together can start putting the pieces together. And that's other that has worked for me. And finally, working with bugs. Whenever I go through a new code base, or new to me, and if it's a legacy code, not Objective-C, I go and work on bugs. I think that's a great way to get familiar with any app, not just legacy. And yeah,
I totally agree.
I think
Excellent. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think definitely picking up that bug and seeing all the maybe the sides that cause that bug definitely gives you a lot more exposure to that system. Jack, what about you? What are your 2 top tips for managing with legacy?
I think the 2 things I would say is trying to get past the initial stage of thinking that all this code is sort of rubbish and we need to ditch it and it's all old and we should just move on. I think often there are ways to incrementally improve some legacy code, even if that's adding some tests. So at least the next time you work with that part of the code base, you have some tests to help you out. Or maybe you can fix up stylistically some of it, or even apply some ESLint rules to catch sort of code quality issues. Like even small steps like that over time can add up to make the code much more manageable to work with. And I would also say that not all legacy code is created equal. You might have a big legacy code base, but if there's a small feature that you never have to work on as the developer, and that code is really bad, but you never touch it, it's kind of fine to back off and just leave that code there because it's doing its job fine and no one has any issues. you want to prioritize the code that is causing you issues day to day, maybe a feature that's really buggy or a feature that's written so long ago that it's really hard to work with and it slows you down and slows your team down every day because it's just a nightmare to work with. So kind of splitting out the code into the legacy code that we can just sort of forget about, and the code that, okay, this is actually delaying our team on a weekly basis and we should prioritize trying to improve that.
Excellent tips. What about you, Suman? What are your 2 tips?
Yeah, I think things that have sort of worked well for me at the times and at my previous jobs is, so certainly when you inherit something, it's really great to talk to the people that have maintained it going forward. So ideally you want to pick an optimist and a pessimist, so you get sort of two ends of the story here, and the story somewhere, the truth is somewhere in the middle, I hope. And then adding on to what Jack and Nelida already said, so as you work in the code and you discover something that was undocumented, being very religious as a team about documenting these new discoveries because so the next person doesn't have to find them. I think that's been pretty helpful. But the other thing, and this strategy will vary depending on how large the code base is. If it's a small software, you can probably figure out without a lot of effort what this does. What are the most important things that this software serves? And if you have a good understanding of that, then you can talk about, okay, how do we test those things to make sure that if we do touch it or we do upgrade something, those things are still working. With larger code bases, that becomes very challenging. So you really want to focus on, in the beginning, what are the most important things this is doing? And even that answer will vary depending on who you ask, if it's an old enough piece of software. But you start small. You sort of optimize for the things that matter the most, and then if you're not touching things, as I said, you're not really worried. But occasionally you will have to upgrade. So you do want to have a good understanding and add, test coverage and documentation about how to test those features, how to make sure those things are still working. And as a leader, I really want to have a good understanding of what is the long-term company plan for the product, for that piece of software. That's it. I'm not going to know very far into the future, but I will have some idea, and people will probably have some idea of where this is going. So you can also optimize your strategy based on what the outlook is for something. And it's important to know. It's important to know how this is going to be used, how long we're planning to keep it around. Is it indefinite? Is it critical? So those are all things that go in as sort of a manager and a middle manager at my level, but they've helped. I think I would start there.
Fantastic. The context of the system makes sense in terms of working out how to invest in it, and deciding how to refresh something is just as important as well. So excellent tip. We've heard about some really good ideas about how to cope or to evolve and deal with legacy. Can you think of an example where maybe you tried to work with legacy and it wasn't so successful? So it's a story of something that maybe didn't work and why it didn't work. Maybe Jack, do you have a story?
I can think back to one a fair few years ago now where we basically took the decision to do kind of a big all-encompassing rewrite of the software. Just thought it's beyond repair, we can't work with it. And it really just ended up being this slow grind where we kept trying to rebuild what we already had effectively, but at the same time we had features coming in to the old system, but we didn't want to add features to the old system because we were rebuilding it, but adding features to the new system added to our estimate of finishing this rebuild. I can't remember, I think we got not too long in and just realized it was going to almost be a never-ending path to getting this thing live. And so at that point, we just sort of pulled the plug and said, well, we've learned some things about how we would build the new system, but we need to do this incrementally in a way that lets us fix critical bugs that come up in the old system or add really important features to the old system as well. And I think for me, that experience very strongly put me off any sort of big bang type rewrites, and is why sort of I think much more now about that incremental approach where you can make changes over time. Thankfully, we realized early enough that we didn't lose months and months and years to building it. But I've heard stories of other companies doing that, and I can easily have imagined it happening to us. So that's what I try and steer away from these days.
Great story, and one that you've personally gone through. That I think that short time experience, I think, is very valuable. As you said, I've seen some companies that have gone 3 years before deciding this rewrite project is not going to work. So, yeah, seen that pattern a lot. What about Suman?
Hi. Yeah. So I'm actually going. It's a variation on sort of what Jack was talking about. Is sometimes you build something 10 years ago and the business needs have changed. Maybe you started with a small piece of software that one team could control entirely. And maybe that has grown and you have a lot of different teams contributing to that code base now. So that quickly becomes unwieldy and your product development cycle becomes really slow. So sometimes, and so that case you may want to do a rewrite, not an exact copy of all the features that your software supports, but just a different way so you can support having independent owners of components. So doing something like that, which we've sort of done in the last couple of years, the big problem that we come into is, as Jack was alluding to, is you wind up maintaining two systems in production, right? So you haven't fully migrated everyone onto this new component that you build, so you're maintaining two systems. So you're having to upgrade two systems or add features to two systems, and that becomes very unwieldy. So I think sometimes a rewrite really isn't the right word. Sometimes you have to evolve your software, but it's really important to decrease the amount of time that you're running two pieces of software doing the same thing. I think I've done that in the past, and that's always been a bad idea because it ultimately just slows you down.
Excellent lesson learned and very valuable for our audience. What about you, Nelida? Is there a case of working with legacy that didn't work out so well, and what maybe was learned from that?
Yeah, sometimes, like it was mentioned, sometimes there are not resources to do a rewrite, and the only option is keep maintaining the code base. And I think one of the things that has not worked for me is just the way that I frame things. I think framing legacy code in a positive way has been very useful to me. Saying, okay, I won't be working with the newest shiniest language, but what can I learn from this code base? I think that I have learned more by reading code from other people than like what I learned like writing my own code. So I like to see it that way. What are the things that I learned from this code base? I have learned a lot about design patterns by reading code that was written in these old code bases. Discipline, having to deal with things that you don't understand require a lot of discipline, and finding all the tools that you need to apply to get to understand it. So to me, it's more about framing everything in a positive way. And I think like any developer can do can learn a lot of useful things with working with legacy code.
That's a really fantastic mindset. And let's maybe expand on that a little bit. So Nelida is talking about learning something from legacy code that wouldn't have been able to be possible from sort of writing from scratch. Jack, can you think of a lesson learned from working on legacy code that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn otherwise?
I can't think of one specific example, but broadly, I've come across this multiple times where I've landed in some code, and I think we've all done this. You do that thing like, who on earth wrote this? And you back, and it was just you 6 months ago. And I used to sort of get frustrated at that, like why did I do it that way? And I think what Nelida was saying about mindset is really important, because I've sort of worked on sort of not beating myself up about the mistakes I made 6 months ago, and realizing that actually now, having seen that the design choice I made 6 months ago wasn't the best one over the long term, that's a really good opportunity for me to take that into whatever next new feature I build, or whatever bug I fix next. Can I fix it better, or build the feature in a way that means in 6 months' time, maybe I will be happy with my previous self rather than frustrated about the choices that I made. So really, I've seen like when you come across code that is not ideal, taking that as an opportunity to think, okay, why at the time was that written? Like, what context did they have that made that the best choice at the time? And what can we learn since from how it's either gone well for us, and this is a pattern we should reuse, or how maybe it hasn't been so easy to work with, and we can learn from that when we're next building a feature. So I think I really love the mindset point of sort of not beating yourself or your colleagues up about sort of code that you're now struggling to work with, but instead thinking, okay, we can now all learn from this, and it's a good opportunity to improve our code base going forwards.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's expand on the topic that both of you touched upon, Jack and Nelida, about mindset. So Suman, as a director of engineering, you are working with lots of engineers. How do you sort of frame it so that legacy can be seen with a positive mindset for your engineers?
Yeah, I think, so it's, I think you start out by saying, if you think, oh, this is a burden that we have to maintain, that is automatically you're getting off on the wrong foot. I think you have to sort of assume the best of intentions when something was written, and often, it's hard to believe, but often there are some very, very robust and well-written legacy software that were just built in a different way a few years ago. So I think you can learn a lot from reading that. This was the way, especially if you're a historian, those things are very interesting to you. And then you sort of deal with constraints that, this is what it was built this way because those were the constraints 3 years ago, and now those constraints don't exist. So you sort of really get a good understanding of why software development has evolved the way it has, because some of those constraints have gone away and we have new ability. So you sort of, as soon as you understand why you did something the way you did it, that really helps your understanding and sort of helps you grow as an engineer. So I try to talk about that a lot with the teams, and sometimes I can give you an example. At the times we've had editors in the newsroom with very sort of limited coding background that build very complex tools that help with newsroom workflows, and you can't, they're not trained software engineers, so you can't help be impressed at sort of the initiative and the ability to change the way they fundamentally work just because they learned how to code because they needed to. And that's pretty powerful.
Excellent lessons and wonderful advice. Let's take some questions from the audience and let's see what our panelists have here. So there's one here which describes, what do you think is most useful for your future self and colleagues when writing software so that people are not judgmental or maybe not so keen to work with legacy software in the future? Maybe Nelida.
I think it goes back to how you mentor other developers and how you foster in your own team that positive environment and reinforcing the fact that the whole team is responsible of the code base, not just the person that wrote the codes, but the person that reviewed it. We are a team and we are all responsible for what we do, and all, like trying to empathize like all those constraints that certain teams had at the moment. Maybe we don't have them now, and I mentioned earlier, try to think that people really are doing their best. It's not like we just want to go and write bad code, right? Everybody, I think, is trying to do their best and trying to go from there and trying to mentor other developers to have this kind of mindset that you can see it as something that you can learn, some decisions that maybe didn't scale well, or maybe things that can be written in a different way because we have different tools that make things easier. But it's not because people is intentionally writing that code a certain or with a bad intention. And yeah, I think it goes back to mentoring and fostering that environment within your team.
I think I've lost Pat's audio.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, maybe Jack, you can think of a concrete example where you can think about how you've made it easier for your future self or future colleagues to deal with the code that you're writing today.
Yeah, I had a recent example where I was working on something where there was some really complicated rules around how we had to convert sort of a value from a certain value into something else. And there were really complicated rules around how this bit of data was transformed depending on various other things. And I think I spent about a day just trying to list out all the different kind of sets of data that could lead to certain outputs. And what I ended up doing in the end is in the code, there's a big comment that describes all this with a link to a doc that sort of goes even further into it. Because I think we always want to write as good a code as we can do, but sometimes it is just hard to make the code you've written be understandable from the outset, particularly if it's a very complicated piece of logic. Like often there's things you can do, but sometimes you just have to fall back on documentation, which I'm a big fan of sort of, if anything, over documenting. I'd rather have someone suggest that we reduce the amount of docs than try and write some from scratch. And so now if me or anyone else goes to edit that piece of code and comes across all these sort of rules, there's a link to docs that fully explain exactly what the context is and what's going on. So my hope is if I have to touch that code in 6 months' time, by which point it's floated well out of my head, it will be quicker for me to pick up the context and remember all those rules rather than having to go through the code line by line and understand it. So I completely agree with everything Nelida said, and we've talked about mindset a lot. And sort of at some point, you also just have to document as much as you can, particularly when the code is just complicated and there's not so much you can do about that.
Absolutely agree. Suman, can you think of anything concrete specifically you would do to help your future selves or your future teams deal with legacy systems?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. So right now, we're working on this idea of what we're calling architecture decision records. So having a system, so architecture obviously is a broad topic, but even sort of at a very low level, you're changing code for a single feature or something like that. So having an infrastructure to actually be able to easily record your decisions is something we're experimenting with, because a lot of stuff that we're writing is going to be around for a long time. We're writing a lot of software, so we're not going to be rewriting all of them. So we're experimenting with that, but I think, at its sort of, if you really break it down, it is really just keeping a record of why you decided to do something, as a, really for yourself, if you were to go back and look at it 6 months later, as Jack was talking about. And that could just be an in-code document. Sometimes that's not going to be enough. Sometimes you're going to have to link out to something else. But we are, as sort of engineering management, we are thinking about sort of having infrastructure around recording decisions, so people can go and find out why something was done a particular way.
Great. Yeah, big fan of architecture decisions as well. And I think what you talked about, recording the why, is super important. All right, let's go to a different question then. So legacy code is often code that works, but isn't written in the same way as that current code. We heard that a little bit earlier in the panel. So you get different libraries or styles evolve over time. So what are your heuristics for dealing with that? What's a good time, or how do you know when to rewrite or update the code to have something consistent? Nelida, do you have any heuristics here?
Not particularly. Some things that we have done with iOS code bases is trying to incorporate new features in the new language. And here we have the advantage that the Apple environment provides you this way to have the two languages in the same code base, and make the interaction relatively smooth. So I think that's one of the things that we have done in the past, trying to incorporate new features. Or if you want to refactor a specific part, then maybe you use the new language. Yeah, I think pretty much that.
That's a good rule of thumb. Jack, do you have any heuristics with sort of deciding when to maybe rewrite or update legacy code?
Yeah, other than it depends, I don't know if I do. It really comes down to this sort of this feeling for me of how much time, I guess time lost or time spent feeling unproductive working in a particular area of the code base tends to be sort of how I try and judge that. But again, that could be a very hard thing. I think once we have decided that a particular thing needs to be rewritten, we then go on to, again, think about how we can do that very much in small incremental steps to try and avoid any of those big bang rewrites. Because that reduces the risk a lot and also reduces the work. If you can split it down into a series of small chunks that you can do one at a time, you can sort of keep track of it and you don't go into this rabbit hole of losing loads of time to rebuilding a big feature. Because what you're trying to do is figure out the amount of time you're losing because this particular feature is so old or so hard to work with versus the amount of time it will take to rebuild it. And then also how much time in the future will we be working on this thing again to make up for that time you've just spent rebuilding it. So it's a bit of a sort of long-term estimating game whilst balancing the amount of time you spend on a weekly basis. So it's hard to get a sort of a hard number, a hard sort of yes or no. But that tends to be how I think about it, like time lost versus gains in the future versus time to rebuild.
Great. Yeah, I think the sort of value add versus the time invested is definitely something you need to sort of balance out. So we talked about some of the strategies of sort of dealing with legacy. We haven't talked about one topic which has come up with the question, so I'm going to give this question to Suman. So you have a system that needs perhaps a rewrite. How do you get buy-in from other parts of the business, or you sell it to other people?
It's challenging. That comes up frequently. I think the happy path, the easiest thing is if changing the system is going to, the value add as you're talking about. If suddenly we can ship 5 times as many features in a quarter than we currently are able to, you can sort of make the, you can, I don't want to say make up the numbers, but you can tell a narrative based on that. But so that's a good sound business. If you're going to ship a lot of new features or a lot of new products, and you want the infrastructure to be able to do that quickly over time, that's an easy sell. But it's rarely that clear cut, right? I think it's in practice what happens is, something takes a long time to do and the next thing takes a long time to do, and those things add up, and they ask you, why are things taking so long to do? And then you sort of get into the details of, well, that's why. And then the other challenge with this is even when you convince them, yes, we need a rewrite, it's very hard to predict how long that's going to take, right? So because we're notoriously bad at estimation, especially rewriting all software. So I think it's easiest to convince other people if it lines up with your business strategy. If it's a piece of software that is going to give us no business value in sort of short term or even in the midterm, it's hard to convince business, rightfully in my opinion, about the need for a rewrite. And then you can talk a little bit about the opportunity costs, as Jack was talking about, like how much time are we spending maintaining this thing, and how what is the value to the business of that time. So you have to use numbers a little bit. You have to sort of try to make the narrative convincing, and it's going to vary depending on the team and the product, but it's not easy.
Definitely not easy, but your advice is definitely useful. Thank you very much. We're out of time, so I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Suman. Thank you, Nelida, for all of your insights. We've had a lot of different interesting stories about hearing what legacy is, dealing with some of the challenges and tips, and some of the things maybe to avoid. So I hope that you've seen that legacy is something that can be effectively dealt with and learned some new strategies to take home with you. Please join the rest of the panelists in the hashtag legacy channel, where they'll be sort of doing some more office hours and we'll answer a few more of your questions in detail. Thank you very much.